There was a city that once ruled the Mediterranean, not with armies alone, but with ships, gold, and a kind of audacity that no other power in Europe could match. For over 1,000 years, the most serene Republic of Venice, La Serenissima, commanded the eastern sea lanes, controlled the spice routes, looted Constantinople, and built an empire on a marsh, on a lagoon, on water. And now, in 2025, the city of Venice has fewer permanent residents than it did in the Middle Ages. That is not a metaphor. That is a census figure. If you've ever looked at photos of Venice at dawn, the mist over the canals, the silence, the ancient stones softened by centuries of water, and felt that something about it was already melancholy, already elegiac, already somehow past tense, you were not imagining it. You were reading the city correctly. Venice is not just a city under threat. It is a city already in the process of a second fall, quieter, slower, and in many ways more permanent than the one Napoleon delivered in 1797. This is the kind of story that doesn't arrive with sirens. It arrives the way Venice itself was built layer by layer, year by year, until one day you look down and the ground has shifted beneath you. If you want to understand how the world's most legendary cities quietly lose what made them worth loving, subscribe. Empire Falls documents the decline the travel brochures will never mention. Let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand what Venice is losing, you first have to understand what Venice was. For over a millennium, the Republic of Venice was one of the most sophisticated governing experiments in human history. Founded, according to tradition, in 697, at the height of its power, between the 13th and 16th centuries, it governed Crete, Cyprus, the Peloponnese, a string of Greek islands, and ports scattered across the eastern Mediterranean. It wasn't just a city-state. It was the nerve center of the Western world's commerce, a fiscal machine, as one historian called it, run by merchants who understood that geography was power and that the sea was money. At its peak, Venice was home to roughly 175,000 people, a population that rivaled any capital in Europe, a population that built the Doge's Palace, the Basilica di San Marco, the Arsenal, Europe's first great industrial shipyard, capable of launching a fully equipped war galley in a single day. The Venetians didn't just trade across the Mediterranean, they shaped it. But slow decline had already begun by around 1500. The shift of Atlantic trade routes drew wealth away from the Mediterranean. The Ottoman Empire pressed in from the east. British and Dutch maritime powers secured the oceans that Venice couldn't reach. And then Napoleon came 27 years old, commanding 50,000 battle-hardened soldiers, and in May of 1797, the thousand-year republic voted itself out of existence. Less than half the councillors even showed up. The Doge abdicated. The Republic of Venice was no more. What followed was looting, occupation, the transfer of the city like a chip on a gaming table between Napoleon and the Habsburgs. The French stole the artworks, sank the navy, and dismantled the arsenal. A humiliating end, by any measure, for what had been one of the greatest powers in the known world. But here is the detail that should haunt you. Even after all of that, after Napoleon, after Austria, after the collapse of the Republic, Venice rebuilt itself. Or more precisely, it reinvented itself. What it could no longer do with trade, it would do with beauty, with tourism. The 19th century turned Venice into what it remains today. A spectacle. A memory palace. A museum that you can walk through and sleep inside. And for a while, that bargain seemed to work. By the mid-23rd century, Venice still had a living, breathing population of 175,000 people in its historic center. Families, schools, bakeries, markets. A city that functioned as a city, not just as a backdrop. Today, that number is below 49,000, and still falling. That is a collapse of more than 70% in 70 years. Not a gradual transition, a collapse. And if you want to understand what is actually killing Venice in the 21st century, the answer is not what most people expect. It is not the water. It is not the floods. It is not even the rising sea. It is something far more paradoxical and far more instructive. Venice is being killed by the very thing that kept it alive. Consider the numbers with the cold attention they deserve. Venice receives somewhere between 20 and 30 million visitors a year. On some days, tourists outnumber residents 400 to 1. In 2023, the city welcomed approximately 30 million visitors, and of those, only about 3.2 million stayed overnight. The overwhelming majority came for a few hours, walked through the same corridors between the Rialto Bridge and St. Mark's Square, took their photographs, and left. They brought almost nothing to the local economy. And they cost the city money in cleaning, policing, and infrastructure strain. Meanwhile, the conversion is nearly complete. There are now more tourist beds in Venice than there are permanent residents. Entire apartment buildings in neighborhoods like San Polo and Cannaregio have been hollowed out and converted into short-term rentals. A landlord renting to a Venetian family might earn somewhere between 500 and 1,000 euros a month. The same apartment rented to tourists through Airbnb can earn that same amount in a single week. Even accounting for agency fees and vacancy periods, the calculus is not close. It is not a difficult choice. And the result is that up to half the apartments in historic Venice may now effectively be tourist rentals. For a young Venetian couple looking to start a life together, a teacher and a nurse, say, or an engineer and an administrator, the math is brutal. A small apartment on the ground floor of the historic center, already prone to flooding, costs as much as a house with a garden on the mainland. The city does not love them back economically, and so, as one source who grew up near the Rialto Bridge put it, he feels like a stranger in his own home. Schools are closing for lack of children. The toy shop that served generations of Venetian families shut down when the rent became unaffordable, and the space sat empty for 5 years before becoming a real estate agency. Groceries close because tourists prefer to eat out. Small family restaurants struggle unless they pivot to fast turnover and tourist menus. The hardware store is gone. The pharmacy is gone. The neighborhood is gone. What remains is a stage set that comes to life during high season and dies in the off-season, when certain streets in Castello or San Polo feel less like urban neighborhoods and more like the lot of a film studio after the crew has packed up. There is virtually no economic activity in Venice outside of tourism. That is the sentence that should stop you. Not the floods, not the gondolas, not the Instagram filters. The complete colonization of an entire city's economy by a single industry, one that, by its nature, prioritizes the experience of the visitor over the survival of the resident. This is the point where it becomes important to introduce the word that none of Venice's authorities like to use, Disneyfication. The idea that a city, over time, ceases to be a place where people live and becomes instead a place where people perform living for the benefit of those who are just passing through. But here is the part that unsettles any simple narrative, because the dependence is total. Tourism contributes approximately 1.67 billion euros to Venice's GDP. Roughly 13% of Italy's entire GDP comes from tourism more broadly, and Venice is the crown jewel of that economy. Remove the tourists, and what is Venice? As one long-time observer puts it, little more than a small town in the northeast corner of Italy, but without the beaches. The tourists are killing the city, but without the tourists, there is no city. That is the trap. The Italian government understands this, at some level. In 2024, Venice became the first city in the world to introduce an entry fee for day trippers, initially €5, raised to €10 in 2025. Tour groups are now capped at 25 people. Loudspeakers are banned. Cruise ships, which were once a central image of Venice's modern absurdity behemoths, drifting past the Doge's palace, like floating hotels, sized for a different civilization, have been banned from the historic basin and rerouted to Marghera. Experts, almost unanimously, assess these measures as band-aids on a hemorrhage. A professor of sustainable tourism at Western Sydney University put it plainly: over-tourism is not simply too many tourists. It is a failure of governance, an inability to regulate the shape of tourism before it reshapes the city. By the time the entry fee arrived, the fundamental transformation of Venice had already been underway for decades. €5 does not bring a family back to the neighborhood. €10 does not reopen the toy shop. And now, there is something underneath all of this that even the most sober analysis tends to understate. Because the population crisis and the tourism crisis are unfolding on top of a third crisis, one that is not man-made in the same way, but which is accelerating faster than anyone predicted. Venice is sinking, literally. The city sits on soft mud and clay in a shallow lagoon, its buildings resting on wooden piles driven into the earth centuries ago by engineers who understood they were building on borrowed ground. Over the last century, the city has subsided by an estimated 23 centimeters. The ground floor of the Doge's palace sits lower today than it did when the Republic fell, and the sea is rising to meet it. Between 1993 and 2019, sea levels in the Venetian lagoon rose at a rate of approximately 2.76 millimeters per year, a combination of global climate change and local geological movement. By the 2020s, St. Mark's Square was being submerged by the acqua alta, the seasonal flooding, roughly 250 times a year. In November 2019, the waters reached levels not seen in half a century. The Italian government spent approximately €6.2 billion on the MOSE system, a network of mobile barriers at the 3 inlets of the lagoon, designed to hold back the Adriatic during surge events. The barriers were activated for the first time in 2020 and were used 33 times in their first 14 months alone. Each activation costs around €200,000. The MOSE buys time. It does not buy the future. Because the projections are unambiguous, sea levels could rise by an additional 50 to 100 centimeters by 2100 under current climate trajectories. A 2026 study by researchers at the University of East Anglia found, in the assessment of Professor Robert Nichols of the Tyndall Center, that there is no optimal strategy for Venice, that every approach requires balancing resident welfare, economic survival, ecosystem preservation, and heritage protection, and that no single measure can sustain the city against what is coming. Scientists now say parts of Venice could be underwater by 2150. March 2025 saw the debut of a new state entity, the Autorità per la Laguna, tasked with overseeing potential interventions and planning for the city's future. Among the proposals being considered is a radical scheme to inject fresh water deep below the lagoon, expanding compacted clay layers to slowly raise the seabed, and, with it, Venice itself. It would cost billions. It has never been attempted at this scale. It might not work. What we are watching, in real time, is a city being crushed simultaneously from above and below. From above, by the weight of its own popularity, the 30 million visitors who love it so much they are consuming it. From below, by the weight of centuries and rising waters that the lagoon can no longer absorb. And there is a pattern here that students of urban history will recognize. When the Republic of Venice first began its slow decline, the historians who analyzed it later identified 2 root causes. One was largely outside its control, the shift of global trade routes away from the Mediterranean, as the Atlantic became the new axis of power. The other was a strategic error, becoming too entangled in mainland Italian politics, overextending in directions that drained resources and attention from the maritime identity that had made Venice great. The decline was not sudden, it was slow. The signs were always there. And the people who might have reversed it were never quite able to agree on what kind of city Venice was supposed to be. That sentence could have been written yesterday. What kind of city is Venice supposed to be in 2025? A UNESCO World Heritage Site has warned that if the historic center's permanent population falls below 40,000 people, the designation itself could be under review. Below 40,000, a threshold that, at the current rate of departure, could be reached within a decade. A former city of 175,000 people at the height of its empire, now defending the 40,000 mark like a fortress with crumbling walls. The residents who remain are, in large part, elderly. Young Venetians graduate and move to Milan, or Rome, or abroad. They love their city, those who have stayed say. The city just does not love them back economically. The schools that have not yet closed serve an aging population. The social fabric thins a little each year. And in some neighborhoods now, you can walk for minutes without hearing Italian, let alone the Venetian dialect that is, itself, a dying language. There are people who protest. The activist group Venezia.com has maintained a real-time population counter since 2000, documenting the depopulation with the methodical despair of witnesses who have given up expecting anyone in power to act. In 2019, thousands of Venetians marched under the slogan, "Me no vado via," I am not going away. The protests made headlines. The population continued to fall. What does history teach us about cities that find themselves in this position? Not inevitability, but pattern. The pattern is that decline of this kind, demographic, environmental, economic, all at once, does not reverse itself through incremental adjustment. The entry fees, the tour group limits, the cruise ship bans, these are the political gestures of a city that knows it is in trouble, but cannot bring itself to make the choices that would actually change the trajectory. Because those choices would require limiting tourism in ways that would crater the only economy the city has left. There is a deeper irony in the ruins of this, and it is one that would not have been lost on the Doges. Venice survived plague, Genoa, the Ottomans, the Crusades, the loss of the spice trade, and a dozen wars. It survived Napoleon. It did not survive Instagram. That is too simple, of course, but the grain of truth inside it is sharp. The city became too beautiful to live in, too photographed to be inhabited, too famous to be real. The success of the Venetian brand, the brand that outlasted the empire by 5 centuries, is the mechanism of its current undoing. If empires fall in patterns, this is the pattern that Venice is teaching the world right now. Not conquest, not plague, not fire, but a slow, structural hollowing out, where the symbol persists and the substance drains away, where the buildings stand and the people leave, where the canals still glitter in the morning light and the churches still echo at Sunday Mass, but the voices echoing inside them belong, more and more, to visitors, to people passing through, to people who will photograph it and leave. The Venetians built their republic on a lagoon because it was the most defensible position available to them. The water was their wall. For 1,000 years, it worked. Now, the wall is rising, and the people it was built to protect are already gone. Empires do not fall in a day. They fall in silences. In empty classrooms. In apartments converted overnight into someone else's holiday. In a city that the world will not stop visiting, and that its own people can no longer afford to call home. Tell us in the comments, which city do you think we should investigate next? And if you want to keep watching the next ones fall before everyone else notices, subscribe. The next chapter of Empire Falls is already loading.